When we picture Magna Carta, we imagine a triumph of democratic liberty. Forget the folklore of Robin Hood or the nobility of good King Richard. The men gathered at Runnymede in 1215 were not fighting for the common man's rights. They were an elite class of warlords protecting their own wealth. Magna Carta was drafted as a reactionary peace treaty. It was a desperate settlement forced by an armed, indebted oligarchy trying to cut their losses. The standoff on that riverbank was a crisis over physical assets. It was a brutal negotiation over who had the power to tax and exactly how much they could take. Across the table sat King John. He operated as a trapped executive, frantically managing a state that could no longer pay its bills. The events of 1215 marked the violent climax of a massive fiscal collapse. Runnymede was a foreclosure proceeding driven by systemic financial failure. To understand John's position, we have to look at the map he inherited in 1199. The Angevin Empire was massive, stretching from the Scottish border all the way down to the Pyrenees in southern France. Maintaining that territory required capital, and the treasury was empty. John's older brother, Richard the Lionheart, drained the state's resources to fund his crusade and required an exorbitant ransom to be freed. This chart compares the annual English revenue across generations. Under Henry I, the crown pulled in an average of £22,000 a year. By the time John took the throne, that baseline had collapsed to just £10,500. Half the budget was gone, right as the French Capetian dynasty launched a highly aggressive military campaign to seize John's continental lands. John faced an impossible math problem. He had to fund a massive multi-front continental defense strategy using a severely compromised English tax base. To survive this crisis, King John turned inward. He rebuilt the English administrative state to function as an engine of financial extraction that exceeded the reach of any previous monarch. The Angevin kings relied on three main streams of revenue: income from their personal royal estates, traditional feudal dues from the nobility, and fines collected through the justice system. The lifeblood of this entire system was a physical unit of currency, the silver King John penny. Millions of these silver pennies were extracted from the English economy, packed into barrels, and shipped across the channel to the central royal treasury at Chinon in France. John took personal control over this pipeline. He embedded himself in the courts, actively trying cases to maximize fines levied against his subjects. He used the legal system to punish his enemies and extract fees from his allies. This relentless, vindictive pressure began to alienate the very barons he needed to govern. Even with the courts running at maximum capacity, the baseline economy simply could not generate enough silver to fight the French. John desperately needed a new financial weapon. The medieval state operated on a strict feudal contract. The crown granted land to the barons, and in direct exchange, those barons provided knights and military service for the king's wars. But there was an alternative called scutage, or shield money. Scutage was a customary cash fee a baron could pay to the crown to buy his way out of providing that specific military service. This timeline charts the frequency of scutage levies over the 12th and 13th centuries. It shows how John aggressively decoupled scutage from actual military campaigns, turning a customary buyout into a standalone punitive tax. He levied scutage 11 times in his 17 years on the throne. That equals the total number of scutage levies from the previous 3 kings combined. By assessing this fee even in years of peace, John converted a practical military buyout into an arbitrary, near-annual tax on the nobility. This systemic extortion allowed John to shift the immense financial burden of the French wars directly onto the balance sheets of the English barons. He also manipulated the inheritance system using fees called reliefs. A relief was a mandatory tax charged to an heir before they could take legally possession of their deceased father's estate. John charged ruinous, arbitrary sums for these reliefs. His goal was to intentionally trap young barons in massive debt the moment they inherited their titles. This manufactured debt functioned as a political leash. If barons stepped out of line, John could legally seize their lands to collect the debt. The extraction reached its absolute peak in 1211, when John managed to squeeze £83,000 out of the English economy in a single year. He took that mountain of capital and executed a grand geopolitical strategy. John bought a massive European mercenary alliance, headed by the Holy Roman Emperor, to strike France from the north while he attacked from the south. The ultimate test of this massive financial investment came in July 1214, at the Battle of Bouvines. King Philip II of France met John's northern allies on the field and completely crushed them. The immediate financial consequence was catastrophic. The mercenary army was destroyed, and the vast fortunes John had extracted from England were permanently vaporized. The defeat at Bouvines instantly bankrupted John's political capital. He returned to England entirely defenseless against a furious class of armed, heavily indebted vassals. The fallout in England was immediate. A faction known as the Northerners, the barons who owed the largest sums of money to the king, mobilized for war. These men weren't marching south to champion a new political philosophy. They were moving to protect their physical assets from further royal liquidation. When the rebels captured London, they broke John's grip on the country and forced him to the negotiating table at Runnymede. The standoff was a stark physical reality. John was a failed chief executive surrounded by his heavily armed, furious creditors. Look at the original 1215 Magna Carta. It reads exactly like a highly specific financial contract. Clauses 2 and 3 target inheritance taxes, locking fees to a fixed rate to end arbitrary, debt-inducing reliefs. Clause 12 states scutage requires common consent, stripping the king's unilateral power to tax. To enforce these caps, the charter created a council of 25 rebel barons with the authority to seize royal lands if John breached the terms. They effectively placed the English crown into receivership. Neither side actually intended to honor this agreement. The ink was barely dry before the peace collapsed, and the First Barons' War broke out immediately. John died of dysentery the following year. His regency government immediately gutted the most radical clauses of the charter and reissued it to buy back the military loyalty of the remaining barons. Magna Carta established constitutional limits through the raw, desperate fiscal self-preservation of an overtaxed oligarchy. Liberty was a byproduct of a struggle for survival.